A warm welcome to all participants to this workshop dedicated to the study the Commission published on so-called killer acquisition in the pharma sector. My name is Michele Piergiovanni. I'm the acting director in DG Comp in charge of pharmaceutical sector of antitrust and mergers. I'll give some introductory remarks before the whole workshop kicks off. As you know, in recent years, concerns about killer acquisition in the pharma sector have prompted both regulatory actions and academic research. On the regulatory front, for example, here the Commission DG Comp, we intervened in several merger cases, such as, for example, AbbVie-Allergan in 2020, where we found that there were significant pipeline to market overlaps or even pipeline overlaps between the parties' activities. And we had a concern that post-transaction, one of the development projects could be discontinued. On the academic side, empirical work was carried out, most notably by Cunningham, Ederer, and Ma in 2021. We suggested that in the pharma industry, a considerable number of acquisitions of innovative competitors might have as object or effect the discontinuation of overlapping drug research and development projects, to the detriment of competition and patients. Based on statistical research in the US, based on the US data, the authors show that acquired drug R&D projects are more likely to be discontinued when they overlap with the acquirer's existing product portfolio. Furthermore, according to the authors, killer acquisition disproportionately seem to occur just below the merger control thresholds of the US competition agencies. Based on these insights, so our enforcement track record and academic work carried out, we in DG Competition, in particular Thomas, Vincent, and our whole principal advisor team, decided to start a research project which had essentially two main parts. The first part was a more fact-finding exercise, which was aimed essentially at assessing how pervasive, how frequent are killer acquisitions and what are the main characteristics of these transactions. We wanted to essentially try to gain insights on how widespread the practice is in reality, possibly identifying which transactions were actual real killer acquisition in the period under the study, which was 2014-2018. And we actually did not limit the work to transaction structured as concentration as M&A, but also to non-M&A transactions concerning R&D agreements or licensing deals. The second part of the study was looking at our own work in DG Comp and looking ex post at our cases that we were notified to us under the merger regulation and which we scrutinized to see whether we in DG Comp actually correctly anticipated the risk of the possible discontinuation of competing licensed drug R&D projects and the importance of this discontinuation for competition in the pharma sector. This study was carried out by the consultancy Lear in cooperation with industry specialists and academics, and as you probably know, the results were published in November last year. I'm really looking forward to hearing the discussion today, which we have a very rich program which looks as follows. First, we have some of the authors of the report, Paolo Buccirossi, Alessia Marrazzo, and Douglas Nave, presenting us the finding of the study. The presentation will be followed by a first panel, which essentially will discuss killer acquisition and their impact on innovation competition. This will feature Professor Kamil Ornaghi from the University of Southampton, Professor Ederer from Boston University, and Justus Outcap from the University of Düsseldorf, and will be moderated by our own Vincent Verhouden. There'll be a coffee break after that, and then a second session, a second panel, which will discuss the different legal forms of killer acquisitions and their detectability, how can they be detected by competition authorities. Here the panelists will be James Southworth from the US FTC, Anne Robert from the law firm Sidley here in Brussels, Professor Thomas Woolman from Chicago Booth, and will be moderated by our own Ulla Schwager from DG Competition. After all these, Thomas will wrap up everything with his concluding remarks. So without further ado, let's turn to the first presentation and introduce the speakers. We have three of them. We have Paolo Buccirossi, who is director and founder of Lear, who, after working as an economic advisor to the Italian Competition Authority, set up Lear in 1999, and since then he advised companies and public institutions on a wide range of competition issues, including cartels, abuse of dominance, and mergers in different industries, including the pharma sector. And also, Paolo has also led several research projects for the European Commission, the Parliament, and other national authorities in the world. We have then Alessia Marrazzo, also a partner at Lear, who has a wide experience in litigation cases, supporting clients in damage action international arbitration cases. She also advised clients in a number of sectors, and at Lear also works on ex post evaluation of competition policy on behalf of the European Commission and NCAs. And then we have Douglas Nave, who is a retired partner from US law firm Weil Gotshal, where he specialized in competition law for more than 30 years. After practicing in the US, Doug moved to Europe, heading Weil's London office and competition practice, and acted as counsel in several mergers and acquisitions in various industries, including the pharmaceutical sector, as well as on advising clients on technology licensing agreements, co-development, and co-marketing arrangements. Before leaving the floor, I promise my last point before closing. There will be the possibility for all participants to interact with us through the chat box in WebEx, so please don't hesitate to ask your questions there. I would only kindly ask you to keep your burning general policy questions for the first and second panel, and limit the interaction during the first presentation by the colleagues from Lear on clarification questions on their study. And with this, I'll stop and I give the floor to you, Paolo or Alessia. I don't know who will be starting.
I will be starting, Michele. Thank you so much. I will just make some preliminary remarks before leaving the floor to Alessia and Doug, that will be presenting the findings and the results of the study. First of all, I want to take this opportunity to thank the Commission and DG Comp, not only for providing us the opportunity to make this interesting research on an important topic, but also for the support during the execution of the project and for continuously, challenging our work, which is, the best way to keep us going on. Okay, first of all, I want to say a few words about the scope of the project, and let me start by saying what we mean by killer acquisition. When we talk about killer acquisition, we mean basically a theory of harm, and the theory of harm is concerns a situation in which there are two companies who are potential competitors because they both have a research and development project for competing drugs, or one of them has such a research project and the other one is already marketing a drug that will overlap with the likely outcome of the research project. And if the two companies enter into a deal, the consequence might be that one of the development projects or the development project that is involved in the deal will be discontinued, with the effect of eliminating this potential competition and affecting substantially competition in the market. Now, this theory of harm, as you can see, can apply to mergers, but also to other types of transactions. And if we focus on mergers, this can happen for transactions that are below the threshold that trigger the obligation to notify the deal, but also, to regular mergers that will be scrutinized by the competition authority within the normal procedure. So sometimes in the debate, there is, some confusion between below threshold mergers and killer acquisitions. The two concepts may overlap sometimes. They may refer to the same situation, but they are different. So the study is not on below threshold mergers, but on the theory of harm when the pharma sector is concerned, even though, of course, some considerations in the study are also developed on the below threshold mergers. Okay, as Michele said, the study is divided in two parts. The first part is about the fact-finding challenge, and in this part we analyze all the transactions that occurred in the pharma sector during the period from 2014 to 2018. And we devised and applied a methodology that uses only information that is publicly available, and that's very important. And the purpose was to understand, first of all, the size of the phenomenon, so how big and how frequent it is, and also to identify some indicators that could help identify transactions for which this competitive risk exists. And most of the discussion today will be about the findings of the fact-finding part. The second part is what we call the evaluation challenge. And in this part, we aim at assessing the enforcement activity of the Commission in some merger cases in which the killer acquisition theory of harm was investigated. But also we want to discuss whether the current legal and regulatory regime provide the necessary tools to prevent killer acquisitions, and which of them is more appropriate to deal with this kind of issues. Now, before leaving the floor to Alessia, I have just one final remark, which concerns the size of the phenomenon. We might agree or disagree whether the size of the phenomenon is relevant or not, or the frequency of these killer acquisitions is high or not. But I want just to remember that this is just one of the variables that enter into the equation that defines the importance of contrasting killer acquisitions. The other crucial variable is the size of the harm that can be caused by killer acquisition. And in some sectors, such as the pharma sector, maybe other sectors such as the digital, we have to understand that innovation is a key competitive dimension. And sometimes in some markets, potential competition is the only form of competition that really exists, which means that preventing killer acquisition might be really crucial, even if they are not so frequent. Having said that, Alessia, will leave it to you. Enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Paolo, and thank you to DG Comp for providing us with the opportunity to discuss the results and the implication of our report. I will need some slides for my presentation, so I will share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Okay, so I will focus on the fact-finding challenge and the results of the fact-finding challenge, and then Doug will cover the main findings of the evaluation challenge. As it has already been stressed, this study assessed all transactions in the pharma sector in the period 2014-2018, which means that we do not only looked at the concentration, but also other type of deals, such as R&D agreements, licensing agreements, joint venture R&D, and I can anticipate that the most interesting results indeed lie within this deal type. I also wanted to stress other two novelties of our study. One is the method, because we employed a large-scale automated analysis of a database which combined different sources, and most of them are public sources. But we also did a manual screening of some transactions. So we did a case-by-case assessment, and we looked at the facts of the cases to understand whether what happened was consistent consistent or not with the killer acquisition narrative. And the second novelty, which has also been stressed before, is that our dataset is mainly based on public sources. And I have prepared the slide here and trying to provide you an idea of the effort we made to build this dataset. We start with, of course, the list of transactions occurred in 2014-2018, which is the only proprietary source that we used, and has been provided by Addis, whose coverage is based on the public announcement of deals. So we have the list of transaction, and we also make sure that we do not only have information of on the parties involved in the transaction, but also on the group to which the parties may belong. Because in the end, what we want to understand, the starting point of our analysis, is to understand whether there is a common interest, a common research interest between the parties involved in a deal, which is a starting point, which is the thing that might trigger a killer acquisition. So we have the list of transaction, we have the parties involved in the transaction. Then what we had to do is to understand which was the portfolio of which was the investment that the parties were undertaking at the time of the deal. And for this, we used clinical trial. Clinical trial is the key piece of information that we used in our analysis, is the US registry of clinical trials. And we developed a Python code that helped us to capture screenshot of the clinical trials registry over time, with the aim of building the historical development of the portfolio of the parties involved in the transaction before and after the deal. Of course, it is important. It is basically the objective of the analysis to understand which has been the evolution of the portfolio of clinical trials of the parties involved in the deal. And it is even more important to understand whether this portfolio somehow, in some way, these two portfolios in some way overlap. And to do that, we used Addis drug and information on the therapeutic indication and mechanism of action provided by Addis drug. Of course, and another piece of information is to understand whether after the deal, the clinical trial in the end has led to the drug, to the drug R&D to be commercialized. So in the end, it has been marketed. So we also have a registry of marketed drugs, the orange book, the purple book, which cover the US, and the APAR, which cover instead the EU. So as you can see, we basically combined multiple sources to have this large database that could help us understanding the evolution of the portfolio of clinical trials of the parties involved in the deals that we have examined. Of course, every time that one is doing an empirical research, he or she has to be aware of the limits of the data that is using to measure the phenomenon. And as I said, the crucial piece of information here is clinical trials. Now, while reporting in clinical trial is required by law, the information in this registry might be incomplete. For instance, also because there is no mandatory requirement to register phase 1 trial, but most importantly, the registry does not cover preclinical trial. So in these studies, we are not looking whether after the deal there is an overlap between the preclinical trial of the parties involved in the deal, because everything we are looking at is everything that is included in clinical trial. So which is the methodology that we have been using? I like to think about it as a filtering approach, because we basically developed a 5-step methodology, and at each step we filter out transactions that could not be examined or that could not whose characteristics were not aligned with the killer acquisition narrative that we were looking for. So we start from all the transactions occurred in 2014-2018. Then we first identify the transaction for which we could identify the drug object, and this is very important somehow new compared to the existing research. And the reason why we did that is that because we are also looking, for instance, a licensing agreement. So it is very important in case you want to look for a killer acquisition narrative in licensing agreement to understand which is the object of the license and whether there is an overlap between the object of the license and the portfolio of the licensing company. There were cases for which the information provided by these deals were not enough to understand the object of the license or the object of the R&D agreement. These deals have been filtered out, have not been examined. Then, as I said, the crucial piece of information is clinical trial. So if the parties involved in the deal do not appear in clinical trial, or if the parties involved in the deal appear in clinical trial, but their trial are not active at the time of the deal, we cannot use this transaction to think about the killer acquisition narrative. So these transactions have been filtered out. So once we have at this step all the transactions that we could examine based on clinical trial, we looked at the overlap. And we have defined the overlap between the drug R&D projects of the party involved in the transaction based on two criteria: the therapeutic indication and the mode or mechanism of action. We focus on innovating human drug R&D projects compared to the projects leading, for instance, to the development of generic or to development of medical devices. And as I said, we do not cover preclinical trial, and we focus on pipeline to pipeline overlap or marketed to pipeline overlap. So at this stage, we now have all transactions that could be examined through the data that we have, and that led to an overlap between the portfolio of the parties, an overlap defined based on therapeutic indication and mode of action. What we did at this stage was to identify the discontinuation, whether there was a discontinuation or not. How do we classify the discontinuation? First, two conditions. The first one, we see whether there has been any progress in the therapeutic indication of the overlap after the deal. The second one is that we look at the clinical trials that were active at the time of the deal, and we looked at their evolution after the deal. Consider that our period of analysis was period observation was up to mid-2022. So it means that even for the last deal in our database, the one that took place in 2018, we have 3.5 years to observe the evolution after the deal. And we use the period of inactivity to identify the discontinuation. So if the first condition is satisfied, so there has been no progress in the therapeutic indication, no new study, and we see that the clinical trial active at the time of the deal were completed or suspended for more than 24 months, we conclude that there has been a discontinuation. And the deals for which we conclude there has been a discontinuation, move on to the next step of the analysis. One important thing before we move to the next step is that one very interesting information provided by clinical trial for those trials that have been terminated or withdrawn is the reason of termination. And this helped us also to distinguish between benign discontinuation, so discontinuation grounded on technical safety reason, and more suspicious discontinuation. We basically looked at the reason reported in the registry. We looked at the keywords, and if keywords included in the reason were such low accrual or poor experimental design, we basically classify that as a benign discontinuation. If instead one of the keywords is sponsor decision, business or strategic decision, we basically classify that as the suspicious discontinuation. So we move on to the next step of the analysis. And the next step of the analysis is to look at those transactions that led to a prima facie relevant discontinuation. So discontinuation without apparent convincing technical or safety reason. Now, at this stage, we are very close to the results of our analysis, because at this stage we had to understand whether there were elements, factors that were consistent with the killer acquisition narrative. We first tried within the large-scale analysis and machine learning algorithm, because the idea, as Paolo was mentioning at the beginning, was to understand whether there were indicators that could help predict transactions that were more likely to be consistent with the killer acquisition narrative. So we developed this machine learning algorithm based on indicators borrowed from the literature related to the number of competitors or to the development stage of the overlapping drugs. And what we found indeed is that prima facie relevant discontinuation are of diverse nature. So it is very difficult based on few indicators to identify transactions that are more likely to be consistent with the killer acquisition narrative. So basically we had the transaction identified by the machine learning algorithm that were that to us appear as much likely as other transactions not identified through the machine learning algorithm to be consistent with the killer acquisition narrative. And that's the reason why we decided to have a manual screening of mostly all prima facie relevant discontinuation. And the manual screening looked at three elements. The first one, the substitutability. So we identified the overlap based on the therapeutic indication and mechanism of action. So we investigated whether these two criteria were enough to say that the two drugs were substitutable. Second one was to look at the technical viability of the drug R&D projects, because the idea of this narrative is that the discontinuation would have not occurred in the absence of the deal. And to do this was very important to have the support of the expert in our team, which have expertise in medicine, biology, so they have a scientific background that could help us understanding the technical viability, as I said, of the drug R&D project. And finally, of course, also the level of competition in the relevant market. So whether discontinuation could alter competition in the market. So which are the results? We find that for 37 of the deals where the narrow overlap between drug R&D project could be established, there is a need for further scrutiny. These are 89 out of the 240 deals for which we have established a narrow overlap. So for these deals, based on the lasso, based on the manual screening, we cannot conclude that there was a technical reason explaining the discontinuation, and we conclude that there is a need of further scrutiny based on private information that could help better understanding the parties' incentive or the substitutability between the drug. And you see in this pie chart the distribution of the annual number of deals deserving further scrutiny, and you see that in absolute number, the number of deals deserving further scrutiny are mainly licensing and are R&D agreement. And I have one last slide. I will cover it very quickly because I also think it is very interesting. So based on the M&A deals, we try to understand whether those deals deserving further scrutiny exhibit typical characteristics compared to the other deals in which we did not find a discontinuation, or where we found that discontinuation was benign. And the analysis reveals that the M&A discontinuation deserving further scrutiny involve overlapping drugs at advanced stage of development. So both the overlapping drugs are both in phase 2, or one is in phase 2 and the other one is marketed. And this discontinuation occur in concentrated market where there are no competitors at all and when there are no competing drugs that have been marketed. So these are features that we see in those deals deserving further scrutiny, but we do not see in those deals with no discontinuation or with benign discontinuation. The extensive drug portfolio of the acquirer relative to the target, or the ideal value relative to the target's turnover, does not seem to be, at least based on the transaction that we have examined, exclusive to a deal deserving further scrutiny. And I'll stop here and I'll leave the floor to Doug for the evaluation challenge.
You're muted.
You're still on mute, I'm afraid. Now it's good.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Is that better?
Yeah, it works.
Can you hear me?
We can. Now not.
Can you hear me now?
Okay. Now yes.
I don't know why this isn't working. It was working a little while ago.
Now it works. Now it works.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, you can.
Yes.
There's a thumbs up. Okay. I was waiting for somebody to say something. All right, thanks. Well, we looked at 5 merger decisions under the EUMR to assess various facets of the Commission's analysis, whether they got the market definition right in light of what happened in the markets after the decision was issued. You know, we were trying to look at developments in the market, who actually got a drug to market, who dropped out, and to see whether the Commission's assessments as to what was likely to happen in the market and the existence of real or not so real competitive constraints was realistic at the end of the day when you look back at what happened. And we found the Commission did a really good job. You know, they tended to have a really pretty good fix on how the markets were likely to develop. Didn't find a lot of things that I think we would have assessed very differently. I guess that's not terribly surprising given all of the Commission's data sources, but you know, it's a nice confirmation. The one area where we had some concerns, I guess, when we were reading through what had happened was in particular Johnson & Johnson Actelion, where the Commission adopted a remedy that didn't seem to be terribly well suited to the problem. In that case, just very briefly, there are some slides. I'm not going to flip through them unless somebody wants to do that for me. The question was, Johnson & Johnson acquired Actelion. Actelion's newly formed subsidiary, Isidoria, was going to develop its early stage products. And one of the products that had an overlap was orexin receptor antagonists, which are chemicals that work in your brain to help you become alert and aroused. And some people have insomnia problems because their antagonist pathway their receptor pathway doesn't work properly. The orexin receptor antagonists, the ORAs, are supposed to correct that. And it's a new class of drugs. And at the time Johnson & Johnson bought Actelion, the expectation in the industry was that these were going to be transformative, that they were going to be so much better than sleep aids and all the other things that have been developed over time, benzodiazepines, all of the drugs that have various side effects or can be addictive. These ORAs were going to be great. Didn't work out that way, which is one of the interesting learnings from the Commission's assessment. They went with the industry view in 2017 and said transformative, and then the first ORA hit the markets and flopped. And the reason it flopped was because the regulators who had issued marketing authorizations in Australia and Japan and the US, not here in the EU, had reduced the marketable dosage so low that the ORAs were no longer very effective. And so the company that was supplying them couldn't show any reason why it would charge such a high price for them. That company ultimately didn't even apply for an EU marketing authorization. It just kind of walked away from the product category. Johnson & Johnson and Actelion both pursued phase 2 development programs for their ORAs. This was, as I recall, it was the first merger decision where the Commission intervened with 2 phase 2 drugs. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's right. It was a little bit surprising at the time. And the commission ultimately, what I think is also surprising, and I would appreciate it as a practitioner back in the day, but surprises me when I think about it from a little bit more objective distance, was that Johnson & Johnson was allowed to keep an economic interest in both of the products that were overlapping in the pipeline. And the remedies that were adopted in one case worked and in one case didn't. Johnson & Johnson invested in Actelion subsidiary and was put under constraints as to how much influence it could acquire, how much competitively sensitive information it could have access to, those kinds of things, the garden variety kinds of protections. And they were enough, even though Johnson & Johnson got some very compelling kinds of arrangements for co-development, co-marketing, and that kind of thing. There was enough there in those basic antitrust protections that the Actelion drug was taken to market very quickly. And I think it was a space of 5 years. On the other side of things, Johnson & Johnson also had its own insomnia drug, its own ORA, and it was developing that with a company called Minerva, which had been making losses for about 15 years, had never made a penny, and was cash constrained and trying to develop a schizophrenia drug. It didn't really care that much about insomnia. And at the end of the day, the commission had Johnson & Johnson restructure its agreements with Minerva so that Minerva was in charge of the global development of the drug. And Johnson & Johnson's economic interest in Minerva sales here in Europe was eliminated. And Johnson & Johnson was put under various funding requirements so that Minerva had the ability to take the program forward. Unfortunately, what happened? The commission appears either to have been misled or not understood or simply didn't focus on some of the second and third level incentives that were being created by the remedies, because the remedies had the unfortunate consequence that Minerva decided to walk away from the program. The reason Minerva decided to do that was because having made losses for 15 years, they could suddenly get a bunch of cash in hand, pay off some of their debts and invest in their lead pipeline. And that looked better to them in working over the longer term on insomnia. A completely unanticipated result, I suspect, from the commission's perspective. And the remedy was fairly ineffective because nobody was there to ensure that Johnson & Johnson continued to push forward on insomnia development when it already had an interest in Actelion's insomnia drug as well. The bottom line in all of that was that Johnson & Johnson also redirected its pipeline. Since it couldn't control what Minerva was doing in insomnia, it decided to direct its efforts in development toward major depressive disorder. Another interesting thing that you see sometimes in these cases is that you start off thinking the drug's going to be great for one thing, and then the clinical trial shows that it's good for something else nobody anticipated, which is exactly what happened there. I don't believe that Johnson & Johnson redirected its drug in order to avoid competition with the Actelion drug, because the drug is really clear when you read about analyst reports, you read about clinical trial reports and articles about the results of clinical trials. It's really clear that Johnson & Johnson just stumbled onto this major depressive disorder therapy, and that was going to be a whole lot more valuable than the insomnia therapy. So the case is not one of the most successful in the commission's armamentarium of precedents, but it does suggest that you really need to think carefully about the second and third order impact on companies' incentives. One of the more interesting things, and I won't just keep rattling on, but one of the more interesting things that I learned in working on this transaction is, well, you don't have a client anymore, right? I'm retired now. And I didn't have a client to walk me through the process, didn't have a client to give me, expensive reports. And if you have those things, it's really easy to figure things out in about 2 hours, right? But we didn't have any of that. And so I was relying entirely on public information, just like the commission often does, and like others who don't have a lot of resources from the public sector, from the private sector have to do. And there's a lot of information out there. You start with clinical trials. This is what Alicia was talking about. You start with clinical trials. That sends you immediately to a database called PubMed, which I frankly had never really used too much, and it's enormously helpful. PubMed is a website that the US government maintains with tons of articles, citations, abstracts written by researchers in any field you can imagine. And if you read through for 2 or 3 or 4 hours in PubMed, and a lot of those articles are available without a paywall, you kind of get to be the same place you might have been if you'd been interviewing a client for half a day. So PubMed is great. Organizations that establish clinical guidelines, SEC filings. We found one transaction, which I won't say a lot about, but I was convinced that if the regulators really wanted to go after it, they could go after it in Article 101, because the companies, I think, the evidence in their securities filings showed that they had decided to terminate one of their overlapping drugs before they ever got to market and the stock changed hands. It was a tender offer. So when you're looking at tender offers, there's a lot of information in what the parties have to put in their SEC filings, including presentations they make to their employees and things like that. If you dig in the SEC filings, we found a lot there. The trade press, a silly little website called Fierce Pharma, which almost looks like a joke, but it actually tells you a lot. You know, it just has a way of touching on points that you would want to think about. So a lot of research can be done. You can learn an awful lot just from the public information. And maybe I'll stop there, Alicia, unless you think there might be something else I could profitably say.
Thanks a lot, Paolo, Alessia, and Doug for the presentation. I see there's a question in the chat, which perhaps in line with what I said before, we can keep for the second panel, which is about again the how to capture acquisition which are structured as agreements. And then there's another question which perhaps we also keep for later, unless Vincent, you want to handle it now before you kick off your panel.
Let's perhaps keep some of these questions to panel 2 in particular, I think, where this is most relevant. And I suggest we now move on to the first panel to discuss the fact-finding more in detail, including of this report, and then we can also get back to one of the fact-finding questions I also see in the chat. So thank you, Alessia and Paolo and Doug, for this overview of the study. A very interesting study. I can recommend everyone to have a good look at it on the website. And the executive summary is very accessible, so worthwhile looking at. Now, this first panel discussion is about the prevalence of killer acquisitions and their impact on competition in pharma. And I'm happy to introduce you for this purpose 3 panelists that we have invited. First, we have Carmine Onaghi. He is a professor of economics at the University of Southampton, where he specializes in empirical industrial organization and competition policy. He earned his PhD from Universidad Carlos III de Madrid in 2004 and has published a lot in leading journals. And he's the associate editor for the European Economic Review. He was also associated to this research project of Lear, the Lear report, as an economic expert. Then we have Florian Ederer, who is the Allen and Kelly Questrom Professor in Markets, Public Policy and Law at Boston University. And his research lies at the intersection of innovation, antitrust, and organizational economics, with a particular focus on how corporate incentives, market structures, and strategic behaviors shape innovation and innovation outcomes. He is a research associate also at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Justus Haukap is the founding director of DICE, the Düsseldorf Institute for Competition Economics at the Heinrich Heine University of Düsseldorf. And from 2006 till 2014, he also served as a member of the German Monopolies Commission. He was the chair of that commission for 4 years, 2008-2012. His research focuses on competition and antitrust, as well as the regulation of network industries. He regularly advises public institutions, including the European Commission, European Parliament, German ministries, and so on matters of competition and regulation. Well, we will divide this panel in three parts. And first, we thought that it would be interesting, precisely because we have these eminent economists who have many publications in the field, to basically speak a little bit about their own research in the area, because it will nicely complement what the Lear report has brought to the fore. For instance, Carmine is the author of an article, well-known article from 2009 already, called Mergers and Innovation in Big Pharma, which appeared in the International Journal of Industrial Organization at the time. More recently, he also published a working paper with Lorenzo Cassi on observed changes in patenting and inventor activity following M&A. So he will be talking a little bit about that in a moment. Florian Eder is widely recognized, if not even famous, for his article Killer Acquisitions, which he co-authored with Colleen Cunningham and Song Ma, and which was published in 2021. And among Justus Haukap's many publications, we can count the article How Mergers Affect Innovation, Theory and Evidence, which applied particularly to the pharma sector, and which he co-wrote in 2019 with Alexander Rasch and Joel Stiebel. So, you know, they have plenty to talk about, so we thought let's invite them and have a better understanding of their findings. Then comes round two, where we will ask the panelists to provide their perspectives on precisely the Lear report, strengths, weaknesses, things that they really found surprising. And in round three, you know, we'll ask the panelists for, you know, how they see the research agenda going forward in this area. And as we said already earlier, all along, you know, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box, and then, you know, we will at the end collect some questions and put them to the panelists. Okay, let's start. Carmine, can you please start with informing the audience a little bit about your own research?
Yes, thank you for the invitation, Vincent. And as you said, I was also one of the economic advisors of the Lear report. So yes, my research started when I was a PhD student and was finally published, the first article in 2009 in the JIO. And in that study, we looked at the impact of mergers and acquisition on innovation measured in terms of patent and R&D. So we constructed a treaty group of merging firms and then a control group on non-merging firms, and then we compared the outcome of these two groups. And what we found is that there is a substantial decrease in the number of patents, around 10–20%, and an equal substantial decrease in the R&D expenditure, around between 5 and 10%. As you said, a long time since then, about 15 years ago, and more recently I started looking at a related research question with my co-author Lorenzo Cassi, and there what we do is to examine the effect of mergers and acquisition, not on firms but on inventors. And in particular, we want to understand how the firm-level results that have been obtained in the 2009 studies, and by the way, have been also confirmed by Justus in a more recent article, are related to inventor-level outcomes. And in particular, what I mean is that we want to analyze how the mergers can affect the exit of inventors from the innovation market, whether there is an increase also in the number of inventors that decided to move to another company, and whether these inventors became more or less productive. And finally, we look at how patents outcome for those that decided to stay within the merging companies. And the reason why we want to do that is simple, because you can have a sort of positive interpretation of the results that of the first study, which is the following. It may happen that you have inventors that decide to leave the merging companies, but they move to another company and then may become more, they suddenly become more productive. Or, for instance, those that decided to stay the merging companies also can benefit from synergies, and therefore they also are more productive. So can you move a slide, Vincent, please? I don't see the slides anymore. So essentially, the analysis has been done by looking at the inventors of a firm that we call firm T for target. And this firm T for target is at a certain point acquired by another firm A, which is the acquirer. And as I said, we divided the inventors of the target company in 3 groups. One group are the leavers, so they decided to move to another company or are forced to move to another company. Then there are the stayers, though they stay within the same company. And then we have those that exit. With exit, we mean they exit the innovation market. And the results that we obtain, Vincent, I cannot see the slides.
Can you see it now? We can see it.
You can see it. Okay.
Yes.
I cannot see it. It doesn't matter. I open my own slides. So if you can see the slides, you will see that as far as inventors that exit the firm T and they exit the innovation market, we find a substantial increase in the exit rate compared to what you would observe in normal circumstances. That is, the fact that there is a mergers and acquisition increases the exit rate of those inventors between 7 and 17%. And very important is the fact that for each inventor that exited the innovation market, we have 2.5 patents foregone, which is a huge number if we look at inventors, because it's equivalent to 38% loss in the expected outcome that these scientists could have produced. When we look at the levers that in the slide that hopefully you can see are the inventor here in green, we also find an increase in the departure rate, so the number of inventors that move to another company, and between 12 and 18%. And even for those inventors, we have a decrease in the number of patents of around 2 fewer patents. And again, this is quite a large number because it corresponds to about 30% decrease in their productivity. And finally, if we look at stayer, those that decide, in this case, the blue and the orange inventors that decided to stay within the same company, the results are also not very encouraging in the sense that there is not much evidence of synergies, because stayers also experience a decrease in output of nearly 1 less patent. So in a nutshell, these new results shows that there is a declining in patent, and this declining patent rise in productivity affects both levers and stayers, and this is clearly not the good news. So here I stop.
Great. Thank you, Carmine. And apologies for the small hiccup with the slides, but
actually now I can see the slide.
Okay, very good, excellent. Florian, would you like to take over?
Yes, please.
Research.
Well, thank you very much for having me on this distinguished panel. I'd like to offer a few comments on killer acquisitions. This is work that I did, as everybody mentioned already, with Colleen Cunningham and Song Ma, and was published in 2021 in the Journal of Political Economy. We were originally motivated by a observation of an existing lawsuit that the FTC had against Mallinckrodt, that went after an acquisition that Questcor engaged in, where Questcor, which is a subsidiary of Mallinckrodt, acquired Synacthem, and was found by the FTC to really harm competition by preventing another bidder from trying to develop a drug. I won't say too much about this particular acquisition. I'll just mention that it is really a pharmaceutical acquisition that turned out to be pretty much a killer acquisition, and that motivated our research because we were interested in whether this was a more prevalent phenomenon, where it was more pervasive than just a singular one. And it really captured this idea that by buying a nascent competitive threat, you could extinguish a threat to an existing monopoly or an existing dominant position. Now, there were other discussions of potential killer acquisitions in the pharmaceutical industry. So on the next slide, there is a Financial Times article about an alleged catch and kill or killer acquisition by a biotech group led by Patrick Soon Xiong that ended up also being challenged, Sorrento versus Celgene, that also had these flavors of a dominant existing firm trying to extinguish a nascent competitive threat. And so in our work that we wrote on, we called these types of acquisitions killer acquisitions because they intend to kill potential threats. And I should mention here that this is really only the most extreme form of a nascent competitive acquisition. And what we're focusing on here in this workshop is really the most extreme form, not one that there are other anti-competitive concerns from these acquisitions that Carmine and others have we've done research on. What we were really focused on in this work, it was this very extreme form where we entirely killed off innovation, and not just modified or not just tried to soften the competition, but entirely killed the competition. Now, on the next slide, let me just give you an overview on what we found in our work. We investigated the central idea of market incumbents having incentives to acquire innovative targets. The main empirical findings, which, as was pointed out before, really focused on a different time frame than the current Lear report from 1989 to 2010, and primarily focused on the United States. We found there that the development rate of pharmaceutical projects decreased by about almost 25% for acquired overlapping drug projects. I'll be more specific about what we mean by overlapping drug projects. And we found in particular that these results were concentrated in markets with low and present future competition. So these were concentrated in markets where profits are high because of lessened competition. And so you had an incentive to engage in killer acquisitions because you really wanted to protect the existing profits that you have. We also did a back of the envelope calculation, which I should say is really much less formal than what was done in the present Lear report, where we estimated that about 5 to 7% of all pharma acquisitions in the time period that we studied from 1989 to 2010 were killer acquisitions. One important part of our paper was also that we wanted to rule out other explanations. So it wasn't why were these projects being discontinued? Could it be that they were just the victim of optimal project selection? Or were they the part of an acqui-hire? Were they part of use assets or patents for other purposes? And we found no evidence of such alternative interpretations, and really were able to nail down pretty clearly that the main force driving this decrease in the development rate of almost 25% was indeed a killer acquisition motive. Now, on the next slide, let me tell you a little bit about how we classified these types of overlaps. Now, there are two ways in which drug projects can overlap. One is the therapeutic class. So, for example, what types of diseases do two different drugs treat? In this case here, I'll give you the example of hypertension. And then there are also different ways or different mechanisms through which drugs can treat diseases. And these are called mechanisms of actions. And we argued that really you could only say that drugs were overlapping or drug projects were overlapping if they overlap both in the therapeutic class and in the mechanism of action. So we really looked for a very tight definition of overlap. So on the next slide, we then also, in addition to this overall finding of finding decreased development of about 25%, primarily in markets with little existing or future competition, we then also showed that the types of acquisitions that are particularly concerning, namely these overlapping acquisitions, is on the right part of this panel here. These primarily occurred just below thresholds for antitrust scrutiny. So these were, you can see there's a big spike here for overlapping acquisitions just below the zero, so just below the threshold for investigation, and you did not see a similar pattern for non-overlapping acquisitions. Then finally, we basically tried to say, look, if this exists here, and if this it flies under the radar, what can we do about it? And there's not much that we did, I think, in this paper here, but I've been really encouraged and delighted that so many antitrust authorities, including competition policy authorities in the European Union, have taken this further and have really taken this to heart in investigating various transactions. So I think I will conclude here, and I look forward to discussing this more. I see there's some questions already about how we ruled out other explanations, but I'll speak to that maybe a little bit later.
Good. Thank you, Florian. Justus, your turn, please.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the panel. I am wondering, I also sent around some slides, but they may not be available. Or are they somewhere sort of in here? Because well, that seems Carmina's slides for the next round of comments. I suspect you may not have the slides, or okay, then let me just comment sort of on what we did in our study. The study that you mentioned already, I did jointly with Alexander Rasch and Joel Stibale. And by the way, we may have a bit in retrospect too early with that study, because Carmine, we sent that study, I think, in 2016 to the European Economic Review when you were not an editor yet, I think, and they just rejected it within hours and says, mergers and innovation in the pharmaceutical industry is not a topic of general interest. Yeah. So finally, we published it in the IJO, and the idea, I think, is quite complementary to what you have done in 2009, and also what Florian and co-authors have done. We investigated mergers in the pharmaceutical industries that had been approved by the European Commission between 1991 and 2007. And these were 65 merger cases, which affected a total of 381 firms. These 381 firms are not the firms that have been directly involved in the merger, of course, but firms that have been in the market, because what we did is that we studied the reports provided by DG Competition, so that we also had the benefit that we didn't need to delineate the market, because the Commission had done it for us, so to say, and identified the competitors that were also active in the same market. So if I talk about firms that are affected by a merger, these are competitors also in a market of merging firms, basically. And in the sample that we had, there were 52 firms that acquired at least one of 67 target firms. So There were a few instances where more than one firm was actually involved, and the others are the rival firms that were affected, as said, not directly but indirectly through the merger. And the key finding, and that is what I will show you in a picture in a second, is that not only what Carmine had already found several years ago, that these mergers tend on average lead to a decline in both R&D and patents. It makes a bit of a difference quantitatively, but qualitatively the signs go into the same direction. That sort of the emerging parties are reducing their R&D efforts, but I think that was sort of our addition to the literature, that there's also a broader effect on the competitive dynamics in the market, namely that also the competitors of the merging firm tend to, on average, reduce their R&D efforts. And I can show you the findings more or less in a snapshot. So this is what happens to the merged entities. You see that sort of there's on the left-hand side, this is now locked patents, but you can draw a similar graph for R&D expenditures. Then we see sort of after the merger, the red line, the merged entities tend to reduce, the number of patents filed tend to be reduced, while the control group, and that at that time was done through propensity score matching, actually more or less remains stable with respect to patents filed. So these are not the competitors in the market. These are the control groups of firms that are not affected by a merger at all, actually, but who are reasonably similar, sort of, as for those of you interested in technicalities, done through propensity score matching. The second piece, and I think this is what may have been somewhat new at that time, is that we also looked at what's happening to the competitors of these firms that are merging. And here we see sort of first years after the merger, nothing really happens. They sort of move into the same direction as a control group, more or less. It's pretty close, actually. But then starting in year 2 or 3 after the merger, the sort of lack of competitive dynamics in the market seem to spread, so to say, and the number of patents filed by the competitive firms of the merged entities tend to decline as well. So what does it mean? Can talk about this also in respect to the current year study in the second round. But I think that I would say with maybe some carefulness, but we may even underestimate the adverse effects of killer acquisitions or mergers and the effects of innovation, because they not only tend to reduce on average the merger the innovation incentives of the merged entities, but also have an indirect effect on competitors in that market, so that the entire competitive dynamics may slow down in that market.
Good. Thank you, Justus. And we had a little hiccup, but you solved it anyway, so that's really good. Thank you. So we've had a couple of perspectives, starting from your own research. Let's now move back a bit more directly to the Lear report itself. And in the next round, we would like to ask you to sort of give your perspective on the main findings of the Lear report. Perhaps also if you have spotted any some maybe shortcomings or things that were a bit disappointing, I don't know, and of course also something which you find most remarkable. I mean, overhearing your presentations, it emerges that your work is indeed would seem to be complementary to what the Lear report has been doing in a variety of ways. Carmine, but also Justus, I think you have really focused on the R in R&D, research, preclinical, patenting, inventions, inventors, whereas the Lear report, and also, of course, the work by Florian, is more about the D in R&D, namely, developing, going through these phases, clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, testing, and so on. So it's clearly there is there are complementarities. Beyond that, are there sort of obvious other differences we should bear in mind when sort of comparing these different kinds of studies? That would be also an interesting point we would like to hear from you. Now, Camino, of course, you are one of the co-authors in the sense of the Lear report, and you have important work also on the preclinical front. You might be well placed to make a comparison. Give your exposed perspective on what the Lear study found, please. Thank you.
Yes, so no weakness at all. Let me stress a couple of things about this study. First of all, I think it's the first study, as far as I know, that looks at different type of deals that are non-mergers and acquisition. So in this table here that you see in the slides, you see that those deals are clearly higher in number than mergers and acquisitions. So these type of deals are much more frequent and are about an order of magnitude more than mergers and acquisition. But nevertheless, if you look at the sequence, so if you look at the broad overlap, narrow overlap, by the way, narrow overlap is what Florian before described as overlapping both in the therapeutic indication, in the disease, but also in the mechanism of action. And then you look at the discontinuation and relevant discontinuation, you see that there is a very similar pattern in terms of proportion. And this is a very important result, a very important finding, because essentially, and this probably leads to the discussion we'll have later on, because then it's important to consider whether competition authorities have the appropriate tools to investigate and assess such transaction effectively. Let me also give a detail about technical detail about the report. Doug and Alessia already described the fact that we try to use public information as much as possible, because this is what you would do as an econometrician and an economist looking exposed at those deals. And there is one particular information that has not been mentioned that I found very useful, that are these mesh terms. So mesh terms are reported for each clinical trial, and a mesh term has a different number of codes, and the more specific, the longer is the mesh code, the more detailed is the classification of the therapeutic indication. So to a certain extent, a mesh term is a sort of standard industrial classification. Then when you have 2 digits and 4 digits, and the higher is the number of digits, the more precise is the classification of the industry. In a similar way, the mesh term, the longer is the mesh term, the more specific is the classification of the disease. Is not only tumor or cancer, but a very specific type of tumor and cancer and so on. While I mentioned that, because I think it's interesting for researchers to know that in this way you can see whether a certain clinical trial, certain R&D project is a development compared to previous studies, or possibly is it totally different, is not connected, or is it simply a reorientation. Next slide, please. So other few things that I would like to mention about this study is that what I find interesting but also challenging is that it's not easy to identify, even if you have this large number of overlapping transactions and you have this large number of discontinuation, it's not easy and it's a bit challenging to observe characteristics that can be associated with this discontinuation, this problematic discontinuation. And as Alessia was mentioning, in the case of mergers and acquisition, there was some evidence that these discontinuation are more likely to happen when we are in the later stage of development, so phase 3 more likely than phase 1 in the D part of the development. And usually are more likely to happen when you have a small number of competitors. And this is what, just to repeat what Florian already said before. And obviously these two patterns are a bit problematic and concerning from the competitive perspective. One thing that I would like to mention, because I've been in similar forums in the past, and they say, okay, but then, there are no many mergers, killer acquisition, then this is not a problem. And I would like to say that even if we consider that, just for the sake of argument, that, killer acquisition are possibly rare, we say this number is big or small, I think that merger control remains a fundamental tool. There are a couple of simple reasons, and given that we are talking about killer acquisition, I would like to remain and to keep two analogies, let's say, in the area of crime. And the first analogy is to say, okay, suppose that you have an area where you have a low level of crime, and there are policemen in the area. Then what you say, oh, we should get rid of the policemen because, there is low crime. But then you say, it may be exactly you have low crime because there are policemen, and without policemen, the crime will go up. And the second point, probably more general, is that we all tend to agree that preventing crime is better than responding to a crime after. And therefore, there is a space for merger control ex ante compared to tools that you can apply ex post, like Article 101 and Article 102. And here I stop my specific intervention on the Lear study.
Great, thank you, Carmine, also for your nice analogy there. I'll write it down, it's a good one. Florian, please, your perspective.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I was genuinely flattered to see such a detailed and thoughtful follow-up research building on the work that I did with Colleen and Song. And I'll admit that I was also a bit relieved when I first read the report that it didn't completely overturn our findings, because I was afraid a little bit that I might have to write a follow-up paper titled False Alarm Acquisitions, which clearly is not just catchy a title and is clearly would not have had the same impact. Let me start also first with my comments with a few amazing strengths of the report. The organizer asked me to pick only one strength, but I think that would be an injustice to the excellent quality of the report. Number one, I think what's really great here is that it's a combination of a large-scale automated analysis with qualitative manual screening. And that really is, a great hybrid method, one that we couldn't do in our paper. But that really allows them to detect patterns of project discontinuation that can signal potential kill acquisitions way beyond what we did in our paper. Number two is, I think there's some really interesting methodological advancements here. We relied mostly on statistical patterns in post-acquisition development and focused primarily on mergers and acquisition. Here, what is great is that the report develops a much broader empirical framework, because it looks at these licensing deals, at asset purchases, at R&D agreements, stuff again that we really could not do. And when I presented our paper a bunch of times, we were asked about it, and we sort of said, well, it'd be great if somebody else could look at these things. And so it's very nice to see that done here in this report. For the, I think, economists maybe in the audience, there's a really particularly impressive feature also that I'd like to highlight in the report. In that it operationalizes this concept of competitive overlap, both therapeutic indications and mechanisms of actions, and uses these mesh terms and co-citation patterns in the biomedical literature, again refining ways of overlap in a richer and more granular way that we could do. Another thing that is great about this is, as I said, when I presented our research, we really looked at the time frame from 1989 to 2010. We needed to have a lot of time post acquisitions to see what would happen to development. And what this report here does really looks a lot more at the more recent time frame from 2014 to 2018. So that brings the timely relevance to the discussion. So not just thinking about what has happened in the past, and maybe in the past when enforcement wasn't quite as active and did not quite have the same deterrence effect as it potentially did in the more recent time period. Another thing that I really, really like about this report is that it really looks at factual evidence on a much more deal level basis. And that's a notable departure from existing academic work, including my own, which really primarily identifies statistical correlations, average treatment effects across large samples, but it can't tell you very specifically sort of like what specific deals are of concern. I think many people have asked me over the years, so which ones of those killer acquisitions, which ones are the ones that we should really look at? And my response is often is, look, we have this average finding, and we can't tell you specifically about any given deals because that's not the methodology of our paper. And that's something that actually here is addressed very nicely. Now, one weakness, because I'm an economist, we always tear down other people's research. So let me say one small thing about the weaknesses of this. Again, it's a weakness in that it relies on public information, and that plagues most research. And so it is questionable of how much could we actually find out of whether killer acquisitions are occurring here if we also had access to private stuff. Now, that's not the point of the report. The point of the report is saying, look, we can update all these findings and we can look at just with public data, can we identify potential killer acquisitions? But it also highlights again that we urgently need better access to internal deal rationales, development pipelines, and maybe post-deal innovation outcomes to really pinpoint of, is this really a killer acquisition or not? So I'll stop that here. A fantastic report, really nicely complementary to the stuff that we did here. And what I would say that, it'd be great if what is underappreciated and maybe just also really nice here is that there's so much additional stuff that goes beyond what we did in our original killer acquisitions paper and shows that there's so much more that can be done with even just public data.
Great, that's all clear, Florian. Thank you. Justus, your strengths, weaknesses, and remarkable points, please.
Yeah, thank you, Vincent, and thank you, Florian, that you mentioned almost everything. So I don't need to say a lot anymore. But since you asked us, Vincent, to give one strength, one weakness, and one surprise or remarkable result, I can really, first of all, let me really congratulate the authors, but maybe also the European Commission that has commissioned the work. Because I think this is really in-depth insights into what's happening, and it's really a fascinating read, I must say. And what I particularly liked, among all the other things that Florian mentioned, is really that it not only looked at mergers, as we often do, but also all these other sort of sub-merger forms of cooperation. R&D corporations and so on. And this is something that we don't have very often, actually. We have this literature on common ownership that looks at like sub-merger forms of cooperation, if you want. Yeah, but sort of I think this is really adds something really interesting to that we can all learn from. What I found surprising, maybe, or from this, but maybe this is because I don't just know enough, is the, let's say, comparatively low number of or percentage of deals with overlap. Yeah, I would have thought there's more overlap, actually, especially if you look at the broad overlap category. Yeah, so that may be a relief to some degree as well, because then we can say, well, there is all these pharmaceutical deals. Many of them don't have any overlap, so we don't need to be too concerned, and it sort of may also then free up resources and we can look into more detail in those that have overlap. Actually, I was a bit surprised, actually, that we don't see more overlap in all these deals. And well, weaknesses, I wouldn't call them weaknesses, but let's say, as sort of once you've read a lot about this, you always sort of want to know more. That's the sort of, I don't know, a deficit, maybe. But one thing I started to think about, well, one is sort of quite obvious, since sort of once you've done your own research, you sort of always frame what you've done in the past. So the natural question for me was, well, what happens to these competitors in the markets? Do we know anything about it? And probably we don't know, but sort of it suggests maybe that the effects of killer acquisitions or discontinuation may even be sort of underestimated in the report if we project that there may be effects on competitors in the market as well. The second thing why actually the report may still underestimate the effects is, and I think you mentioned it in the report yourself, is that we would probably like to know more about speed. we sort of don't know how the speed of innovation is actually changing. We know whether there's discontinuation, but there may be more subtle forms of lack of competitive dynamism that sort of, while the speed may not only go up if there is a discontinuation, that sort of you maybe are not as fast on the remaining project, but even sort of, let's say, if you are competing now with two projects within the same firm, that may not provide the same incentives than competition in the market between two projects. We can probably think of all kinds of models that competition within the firm may be as strong on, even stronger probably than competition in the market. But my first gut would be that maybe competition in the market is stronger than competition in the firm. And there may even be a slowdown if there is not a discontinuation of the research. And the third point that I goes into the other direction. Maybe someone says, but maybe there are some cases where we overestimate the adverse effects of killer acquisitions, and these are the cases. Well, to make it very illustrative, I remember sort of there were these very, very old papers in media economics, when we still had traditional TV and one station was operating one channel, and there was this sort of very simple papers that argued, well, let's imagine 80% of the population want to see movies or entertainment shows and only 20% want to see documentaries. And if you have only one firm, then they will offer movies and entertainment. And if you have two firms, probably they will just duplicate the program so they can share the market and both at 40% and still only show movies and entertainment. And even the third and the fourth firm may still only duplicate the problem. Nobody will offer documentaries until we have a fifth firm. And in this world, would say the merger between the third and the fourth firm may not be so bad, because then they will say, well, one channel for the movies and one for the documentaries. Why am I telling you this story? I'm wondering, if I close down one line of research, what do we do with these people? And this ties into what you mentioned in the first sort of your own research. Where do these people go? Actually, and in some cases, closing down one line of research may not be so bad if they produce documentaries, but if they move to something that hasn't been done before. So there may be some of these cases, and I think to some degree these papers that Joe Seldeslacht and his colleagues are producing suggest that there may be some cases where we have really pro-innovative mergers, and this is not really a weakness of this report. It's just sort of what you would like to know if we could learn everything in the world.
Yeah, indeed. In that sense, it's already a bit about the future research agenda that you have raised a couple of points, which is good and also interesting. Before we touch upon that, you made one point about what you found surprising, and you sort of refer to the comparatively low number of deals with overlap, with broad overlap. So it emerges from the report. Maybe Carmine or Alessia, Paolo, but Carmine, since I see you right here in front of me, are you able to sort of give your perspective on that? Is that relatively low number of broad overlap cases a bit the result of this filtering process that you have applied, where you take out various categories of deals and basically you're only left with, I think, deals with molecules in clinical trials, and only then I think you start to look at is there an overlap, yes or no?
Correct.
Is it correct that this may drive the fact that the number of deals looks relatively low with overlap at least compared to the complete universe of deals?
Yes, this is part of the story, Vincent. I agree with you. Another reason is that what do you measure with number of deals? That is, you have pretty much everything. You have a small lab buying another small lab, two people merging together. So you can easily increase the denominator by, looking at every single leaves that fall out of the tree. But what matters is that if you have large, big merger, which are the typical one, for instance, that I used in my research, and that also used to look at in his research, obviously the denominator, the starting point is much smaller. You have this big acquisition, and there you always find overlapping. And by the way, the overlapping is measured in terms of deals, but for each deals, you can have many more overlappings. So the number of overlappings is also bigger than the overlapping in terms of deals. So all these things can contribute to describe what has been found there in the study.
Very good. Thanks, Carmine, for the clarification. Now on, let's say, working points for the future research agenda. I'm mindful of the time, so we have to keep it a little bit short. I suggest we just have a small round at the end.
Yeah, yes, don't need to show my slide.
So Justus already helpfully referred to at least 3 points, I think, where he would like to see a bit more emphasis and analysis. In particular, he was referring to the effect on competitors, which of course echoes a little bit his previous work, but indeed one might say this is indeed relevant and interesting to look at. Speed of innovation, which is partially but not fully captured by the current study, obviously. Then, of course, the point about, well, maybe there's excessive entry anyway, potentially or not. Just very briefly, and I leave it a bit open, who wants to say something at this point, like something extra that would need to be analyzed as a matter of urgency, and perhaps, you know, where the Commission, as a matter of urgency, should launch the next research project. Can I invite maybe Florian or Carmine, yourself? What's your main point?
Well, so I mean, I think the obvious one to really get at is the better access to internal data. I mean, many of the unanswered questions, whether discontinuation was strategically motivated, whether the acquirers altered R&D priorities post-deal, whether the incentives changed across internal business units, none of these can be answered without firm level documents, with investment plans, internal deliberations. And so, you know, if we have a more collaborations between regulators who sometimes have access to these types of information and researchers that allow for secure access maybe to such information, that would be an amazing development. I understand that that's often impossible, but without it, we're somewhat always stuck somewhere between plausible inference and educated guesswork, or, you know, which is essentially what we do in academic research. So I think the push, I think, would be the one that is great. What I really would love also again here is this, the fact that we do a retrospective analysis and we then use that retrospective analysis to develop new predictive tools. And I think that's the other direction, I think, in which we would more of a push, and maybe how that can even be integrated into merger notification systems in near real time.
Interesting. Thank you. Carmine or Justus, one further additional point from your side? Perhaps?
Yeah, just a quick one on my side is the fact that obviously we are very concerned about the harmful killer acquisitions, but at the same time, we have to be realistic and acknowledging the fact that some small companies do not have the resources to take their drugs to the finishing line. And actually, sometimes for them, it's a good news to be bought. So we have to find, to strike the right balance between preserving competition, but knowing that what are the incentives of this small lab to develop these innovations if they think that at a certain point of the race, they cannot be bought, they cannot be cooperate with others, and they have to arrive to the finishing line. So I think it would be interesting, although I agree with on that point, it would be very, very difficult. You know, you can create a model with different incentives and so on, but then when it comes to the empirical reality, probably it's difficult to create the right empirical framework in order to provide evidence on that.
Okay, thank you. Good. Yeah, that's a useful point, indeed, Carmine. Good to keep in mind. Justus, final word for you.
Yeah, last point, maybe, since Carmine was one of the co-authors, I would really be interested to also what Florian said, develop predictive tools as good as possible. Yeah, under what circumstances it's more likely that we see a discontinuation, but then also move one step further and ask of what happens after the discontinuation. Where do these researchers go? Actually, and it's not only sort of I think excessive entry in the, let's say, sell-off style excessive entry is really because we are dealing with extremely scarce resources, namely very good researchers in that field. So if we can more predict this, they may discontinue something, but let's say move into a completely new area of research. That is obviously, let's say, a killer acquisition that we may even like in that sense.
Yeah. Useful, good points towards the end. Thank you for all the comments, dear panelists. So I suggest we wrap it up right here, thanking all of you. And it's now time for the break. We have overstepped our time a little bit, so I suggest we come back at 15:40 for what is panel 2, about the various legal forms of killer acquisitions. So see you in a moment.
So, welcome to the second panel discussion of this afternoon's workshop, which is dedicated, as Vincent mentioned, to the various legal forms of possible killer acquisitions and their detectability. It was already highlighted before that the Lear study is novel in that it is not confined only to mergers and acquisitions and their impact on pipeline competition in the pharma sector, but that it also covers all other types of transactions, including licensing agreements, R&D agreements, and others. It finds that deals deserving further scrutiny can occur in various legal forms, but yet it's not possible to draw any definitive conclusion based on public data only. The study therefore calls for vigilance by antitrust enforcement authorities. As already mentioned beforehand, in practice, that might, however, at times be challenging, in particular when it comes to below the thresholds mergers that are not captured by mandatory notification thresholds, but also, for example, in the EU, when it comes to other types of agreements, parties do have to self-assess whether there is potential anti-competitive effects or not. Against this background, this second panel is dedicated to discussing the various legal forms and the detectability of potential killer acquisitions. And I'm very happy to have different perspectives of our distinguished panelists to discuss that topic. So we do have James Southwell from the FTC, who will represent the perspective of another agency in charge of enforcing competition rules in the pharma sector. James is an attorney at the Mergers One division at the US Federal Trade Commission, where he has led several merger investigations in the pharmaceutical and medical device sector, but also aerospace industries. He joined the FTC from private practice, where he provided antitrust advice to multinational pharmaceutical companies. Then we've got Anne Robert, who will represent the industry perspective and who is a partner at the law firm Sidley. She has extensive experience in advising multinational clients in antitrust and competition issues, and with particular focus on the life science sector. Anne is amongst the team of lawyers who are advising, for example, Servier in the ongoing litigation involving alleged breach of EU competition rules in pay-for-delay cases in front of the European courts. And then we do have Professor Thomas Wollman, who is an associate professor of economics at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research in the US. In 2026, he will join the Questrom School of Business at Boston University. His research intersects industrial organization and competition policy. His work on non-reportable mergers and stealth consolidation has helped shape various federal and state policy proposals in the United States. Wollman holds a PhD in business economics from Harvard University. And prior to joining Chicago Booth, he worked as an investment banker and entrepreneur. Now, with the introduction of our panelists, I will now hand over to Doug for a short recap of the main findings of the study on the different legal forms of potential killer acquisitions and their detectability. And after that, we'll kick off with the panel discussion. Doug, you may have to unmute yourself again.
Did I do that correctly now?
Now we can hear you. Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's no surprise. I was just saying that the lead category for the ability to detect killer acquisitions and where they most often are likely, I believe, to occur, is in mergers and acquisitions. You acquire the entire business or enough of the business that nobody else can operate the rump assets. And that, that strikes me as a fairly credible, common sense observation, just from my own practice for 30 odd years. The other area that I believe unfortunately doesn't give us as much information as we would like is just because the public information isn't out there, but it's in licensing transactions where you can transfer the technology or tie it up with various kinds of exclusivities so that nobody else can compete with you if you want to preempt a type of technology. And my own view, I know we've had lots of discussions about this with Lear, is that if you're going to have a killer acquisition, I'm pretty sure it has to be an exclusive. Because if it's not exclusive, you haven't preempted the technology. Somebody else can come in and use it. But that hasn't been shown. That's an hypothesis. The other area where I think we haven't found a lot here in this study, but is an area I think deserves scrutiny, is in co-marketing and co-development. Those are hard to pin down with the kind of specificity that would be needed for a report like this. But I just know, again, from experience, that those are the kinds of transactions or agreements that sometimes raise pretty stark issues. We also have found killer acquisitions occurring in warehousing transactions, where a company will buy technology, simply not do anything with it for a while, or in options, like development options, where occasionally I think I've seen enough indications that it really happens that sometimes options are publicly refused, are not exercised, simply to discredit a technology. And so those kinds of cooperative arrangements might be anything but cooperative. I've seen that in the past. So what I thought, there are two PowerPoint slides here. If people have got copies of them, I would look at slide 11, and I think it was slide 9. That was very helpful in getting a fix on the various types of transactions and where issues were found likely to arise. But again, the problem with drawing too many firm conclusions from this is that there just wasn't enough public information about a lot of transactions to assess how often that particular style of transaction was a problem, and particularly in licensing. Is that a good start?
Fantastic. Okay. Thank you very much. With that, maybe we can hand over to, I think there's one slide that is going to be shown, which is kind of like the outcome of kind of like discontinuations that are prima facie relevant according to different types that you meant of kind of like transactions. I guess that this is what you wanted to refer to in terms of showing kind of like outcome per type of arrangement in terms of overlapping research projects, discontinuations, and those that were found to deserve further scrutiny.
Yeah, that was the chart I was referring to earlier.
Look, then we would hand over to Thomas Wollmann to provide his perspective based on his own academic research on and the prevalence and importance and issues with detectability. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks. I'll just briefly introduce the detection program or problem so that we're all on the same page. And I think everyone in attendance knows this, but just to be certain, most governments around the world require firms that are interested in merging to notify the relevant authorities in advance and then wait a few weeks before closing, which gives the agencies time to evaluate the anti-competitive transactions, or potentially anti-competitive transactions, before they're completed. But most mergers around the world are exempt from this notification process on the basis of their size or due to other carve-outs. The problem arises because in many economically important but highly segmented industries, even a small merger can have a huge effect on market structure, on prices, on quality, and ultimately on consumer welfare. So just to fix ideas or give an example, suppose you have an industry where in every city, there's 2 independent healthcare service providers that are competing with one another for patients. And suppose that each of these facilities is valued at about $75 million. And suppose the legislature sets an exemption threshold of $100 million, meaning that transactions that are valued below that amount don't need to be reported to the federal government. In this case, in every city in the country, one provider could acquire the other, and you could have, at least in theory, a nationwide mergers to monopoly, all in the absence of a single pre-merger notification. It's an outcome I'd call, and many others are starting to call, stealth consolidation. If the agencies found out about these transactions in other ways, it would certainly be fine. But my research has shown, and this is really 3 separate studies that are using 3 different types of, totally different types of variation. So I think it's fair to say there's a consensus at this point. My research has shown that when a merger is not reported, that is exempt from pre-merger notification, it is about 90% less likely to be investigated, 90, on average. Now, thinking ahead, that's going to beg the question as to what happens when these potentially very anti-competitive transactions effectively escape antitrust enforcement. One study occurred in the dialysis industry. So in U.S. dialysis, prices are set primarily by the government, by Medicare. And so the margin of adjustment there is quality. Sadly, but perhaps expectedly, in the data, what we see is that stealth consolidation is followed by lower quality, which I measure in terms of higher hospitalization rates and, very unfortunately, mortality rates. There's more death. In the U.S. anesthesia industry, where quality is not an important factor, their prices are going to be affected. In recent work, my co-authors and I show about a 30 to 40% very abrupt price increase in the immediate aftermath of a merger between competing practices in that industry. There's a growing literature in this area, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, apropos for the discussion today. Of course, we have the work on killer acquisitions, which Florian had spoken about. And even more recently, we have work from Chris Stewart and co-authors. That work is going to extend my research in what I think is a pretty provocative way. So the authors are pointing out in that paper that under U.S. accounting standards, at least, research and development expenses are not capitalized on the balance sheet of the firms. So as a result of that, you might have a very valuable biotech company that has on its balance sheet no assets. In that case, typically much higher transaction value thresholds apply. So whereas the typical threshold would be on the order of about $100 million, the threshold kicks up to $400 million. And what the authors are showing is that this loophole, if you will, led to higher prices for developed drugs and the discontinuation of competing emerging drug projects. I think supporting the previous research that was done by Florian and others. There's growing work in other areas, but I think in the interest of time, I'll summarize the research and leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Now, Anne, we've heard a number of times today that there is such a phenomenon as potential killer acquisitions in the pharmaceutical sector. It may come in various shapes and forms, which also impacts on detection or detectability. Now, I would be very curious to hear from your perspective, representing the industry, what are actually factors driving the legal form of transactions in the pharmaceutical sector? When does kind of acquirer decide to go for a merger or an acquisition? When is it rather a licensing deal? But also what are potential factors for discontinuation of pipeline projects, which may not all be anti-competitive or which often are not necessarily anti-competitive. So happy to hear a somewhat diverging view today as well.
Thank you so much, Ulla. And let me start by saying thank you very much for the invitation to you and to the entire DG Comp team. And as you said, I'm going to try and provide a slightly different view to the discussion and come at this from a practical perspective and what we see in our day-to-day work when we advise our clients. And so this is not going to come as a surprise, but there is not one single factor that's going to drive a specific deal structure or form in the pharma sector. If I take, for example, a situation where a larger pharma company will negotiate with a biotech company, there's a whole range of considerations that come into play. First and foremost, if the biotech company is the seller, what are they willing to offer? And what is it that they're trying to get out of the negotiation? Sometimes they just need funding. In other situations, they might be looking to sell an asset or several assets. And in some cases, it might just make sense for them to sell off the entire company. And then another really important element to this is, well, what level of control and involvement do they want to maintain in the transaction? And so those are already really important considerations that are going to drive, are we going to go for an asset purchase? Are we going to go for a license agreement? Or, might we initially start with a collaboration project that can then lead to an exclusive license as the project moves along? Another really important element is, of course, the risk that the buyer is willing to take. Risk and uncertainty are absolutely fundamental in the pharma sector. I mean, this is not a secret to anybody, but those are really, really crucial elements also when companies decide what legal form they're going to pick for a given transaction. And so when we're talking about risk, of course, the earlier we are in the development process, the higher the risk is going to be. And this is even more so if we're at a preclinical stage where the risk is extremely high. When the product is already in the development stage, then the question is, what phase are we in? And of course, again, this is not a secret. If you're in phase 1, the risk that the project is actually going to fail is much higher. If you go to phase 2, phase 3, that risk gradually becomes lower. And then another important element, and this goes to some of the points we already heard earlier, is, well, what therapeutic area are we talking about? And also, what indication or indications might be available at the end of the day? Of course, if there are several potential indications at play, that's going to lead potentially to broader revenues, and that's going to drive the decision making from the buyer's perspective. And then an important element is the overall strategic portfolio and, of course, the competitive landscape. And so we will always look at that as well, of course, to determine, how many other research projects are there, to what extent are they actually overlapping or potentially overlapping. And then maybe a last point to mention is, well, what legal protections are available? We already earlier heard about patent protection. So that's, of course, an important key driver. But also, we advise a lot of orphan drug companies, and for them, is there a possibility to get orphan market exclusivity is a really, really crucial factor that's going to come into play. Maybe one other point that I'm going to mention before we come to the rationale of a possible discontinuation is what drives the value of a deal. I mean, there's a lot of discussion, if there's a high deal value, there must be something inherently wrong with the deal. Well, oftentimes, and actually in the majority of cases that we see, that is really not the case. And I should also say, in the large majority of cases, it's not that all the money is paid upfront. Oftentimes, and this is very much the case in licensing agreements, for example, you will have milestone payments. And so the payment is going to go out as certain development stages are reached. And oftentimes, even beyond that, upon commercial launch, once you get pricing and reimbursement status in different member states in Europe, which is really, really crucial. And so those milestones are really meant to match that kind of risk and uncertainty that I mentioned earlier. And then coming to discontinuation, again, this is not going to come as a surprise since I'm really going to represent the industry perspective. In the overwhelming majority of cases, if there is discontinuation, and that's a big if, there are valid reasons for doing so. I mean, again, I mentioned milestone payments. Those are inherently meant to prevent discontinuation. They're meant to incentivize companies to continue investing, to continue the development. But if you are in a situation for whatever reason that you might decide to discontinue one project over another, that can be for scientific reasons, because some of the clinical data is not as promising as it seemed, Or to use one of the examples we heard earlier, you initially started investing in one indication, and it turns out that actually the product works a lot better for another one. And so you might completely shift your focus. Those are all things that happen on a regular basis, but are perfectly legitimate reasons for either discontinuing a project or for maybe shifting the focus of the research slightly. There can also be financial constraints. I mean, this does happen, that sometimes, drug development, we all know that is extremely expensive, and sometimes it just might not make sense to continue funding on all fronts. So, and sometimes there are strategic business reasons, but also there, I think it's important to remember that those are not inherently problematic from an antitrust perspective. So, Ulla, maybe I'll leave it there for, giving a brief flavor of how the industry typically looks at this.
Thanks a lot, Anne. So we've heard the kind of industry perspective through the lens of a lawyer. Now, the Lear study is actually kind of putting the emphasis on potential killer acquisitions existing in various legal forms. At DG Comp, we have had, as Michele mentioned, a number of cases which were structured as mergers where we saw that there would have been potential anti-competitive effects by discontinuation of pipelines. However, there's also kind of other types of agreements, and in particular exclusive licenses were mentioned a number of times already today, where there can be anti-competitive effects from kind of entering into that type of agreement. And I'm very happy that we have like a representative of the FTC today with us who can shed some light on case examples in that field. And with that, I hand over to James to share some insights on two cases that the FTC has actually investigated in this area.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking DG Comp for inviting me to join this panel to talk about two FTC cases that are relevant to the discussion of killer acquisitions. Before I start, a disclaimer. The views expressed today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Trade Commission or its Bureau of Competition. The first case that I'm going to talk about is FTC versus Mallinckrodt, or as we refer to it in the division, Questcor. In 2017, the FTC challenged Questcor's acquisition of a drug called Synactin that would be competitive to a drug marketed by Questcor called HP Acthar Gel. Mallinckrodt bought Questcor about a year after the challenge conduct, so Mallinckrodt was the defendant in the FTC action, but I think it's less confusing to refer to Questcor as I describe the facts of the case. The acquisition took the form of an exclusive licensing transaction rather than a merger or acquisition. The conduct took place in June of 2013 when Questcor licensed the exclusive rights to develop and sell Synactin in the United States and 35 other countries from Novartis. Synactin and Acthar are both what are called adrenocorticotropic hormone drugs, or ACTH drugs, that are used to treat several autoimmune and inflammatory conditions. But in particular, in the United States, at least, ACTH drugs are the standard of care for treating a rare but serious disorder called infantile spasms. In the United States, Questcor's Acthar is the only ACTH product approved by the FDA to treat infantile spasms, and the FTC alleged that Questcor enjoyed monopoly power in the U.S. market for ACTH drugs. Questcor acquired Acthar from, going back a little bit of the history, Questcor acquired Acthar from Aventis in 2001 for about $100,000. It was an old drug that was off patent, and the price at that time was about $40 per vial. Now, despite the fact it's off patent, there are significant regulatory and practical barriers that protected it from competition. So once Questcor acquired the drug, it was notorious for repeatedly raising the price of Acthar. In one case in 2007, it raised the price overnight from $1,650 to $23,269 per vial. And in 2015, Questcor's U.S. sales of Acthar exceeded $1 billion. Synactin is a synthetic ACTH that is essentially clinically identical to Questcore's Acthar and was approved in Europe, Canada, and Australia for the same indications as Acthar. So as some previous panels described, this would be what would be called a narrow overlap. Synacthin and Acthar shared both the same therapeutic indications and mechanism of action. Questcore had been keeping an eye on Synthactin for a long time and viewed it as the greatest competitive threat to its lucrative Acthar franchise. Novartis was not marketing it or developing it for launching in the United States, but Questcore had been watching warily to make sure that another company did not acquire it to launch it in the United States. When Questcore learned that Novartis was shopping Synactin, it pounced and outbid all other interested parties for an exclusive license to develop and market the drug in the United States. There are several other alternative bidders who were interested in licensing Synactin and developing the drug expeditiously, and these alternative bidders had plans to launch the drug at a significant discount to Questcore's the price of the Acthar drug of Questcore. Once it acquired Synactin, Questcore did not develop it for IS or any other indication that would be competitive with Acthar. So this does fit within the schema or the characterization that had been discussed of a killer acquisition. And the FTC's theory of harm was that by preventing another bidder from acquiring Synactin, it delayed or forestalled competition to its Acthar monopoly in the United States, and thus the legal theory that we pursued was that the acquisition was an anti-competitive conduct to maintain Questcore's monopoly in the United States in violation of the Sherman Act and Section 5 of the FTC Act. The posture of this litigation was a little bit unusual because the FTC chose, in this case, to challenge a consummated transaction in federal court rather than the usual method of challenging it in administrative action. It was consummated because at that time, license acquisitions were not reportable under the HSR Act due to the then prevailing interpretations of what constituted an exclusive license for purposes of determining HSR reportability. Because it was a consummated transaction and the parties could close the deal prior to the FTC taking action, that necessitated a more lengthy investigation. And so by the time the FTC filed the complaint, Questcore had already owned the rights to develop Synactin for over 3 years. During this time, some of the alternative bidders had started to develop their own ACTH drugs. So in this case, we decided to bring the action in federal court to seek, in addition to a divestiture remedy, disgorgement of profits from Mallinckrodt, in order to prevent Questcore from profiting from its anti-competitive conduct. The decision to file in federal court and seek monetary relief was somewhat controversial at the time, and Commissioner Olhausen filed a concurring statement expressing her disapproval of that strategy, although she concurred in the action to seek a divestiture from Mallinckrodt. The case was settled with Mallinckrodt agreeing to pay $100 million and provide a sublicense to Synactin to a commissioner-approved buyer. One note here is that 4 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the FTC does not have the power under 13B to seek equitable monetary relief such as disgorgement or restitution. But I guess that was too late for Mallinckrodt in this case. The second case that I'd like to discuss is Sanofi Maze. This is a more recent case. In December 2023, the FTC sued Sanofi to block it from acquiring an exclusive license for a potentially competitive product being developed by Maze Therapeutics. This was also an exclusive license transaction. However, unlike Mallinckrodt, this transaction was unconsummated and it was reportable under the HSR Act, so the investigation proceeded along the normal path for investigating and challenging HSR mergers, and was ultimately challenged in administrative court along with simultaneously the FTC seeking a preliminary injunction in federal court. Like Mallinckrodt, the FTC alleged that Sanofi was a monopolist that was seeking to eliminate a nascent threat to its monopoly. For a long time, Sanofi had been the only supplier in the United States of treatments for Pompe disease, a rare but serious genetic disorder that causes progressive muscle failure due to pathological accumulation of glycogen in the patient's muscles. Sanofi's enzyme replacement therapies are effective but require the patients to make bi-weekly visits to a clinic to receive lengthy IV infusions, and while effective in delaying disease progression, they often cannot stop the eventual deterioration of the muscle tissue and progression of the disease. An annual course of treatment with Sanofi's Pompe drug costs over $750,000 in the United States. Another Pompe treatment was approved by the FDA in 2023 as a second-line treatment for patients who are not improving on the Sanofi products. The last I checked, Sanofi's worldwide market share in Pompe treatments is still about 95%. So the FTC alleged that Sanofi was a monopolist in the market for Pompe drugs in the United States. Maze is a small biotech company that had been developing a novel treatment for Pompe disease that utilized a different mechanism of action than Sanofi's ERT treatments. Unlike Sanofi's infused product, the Maze product was a small molecule drug which would be taken orally, potentially making a much more convenient therapy for Pompe patients. Sanofi had been monitoring Maze's progress and recognized that its drug was a nascent threat to its lucrative Pompe franchise. And shortly after Maze announced positive clinical results from its phase 1 trials and its plans to initiate phase 2 trials, Sanofi and Maze began partnering discussions. Maze's drug had, at the time, Maze's drug had successfully cleared phase 1 FDA trials and had generated evidence of pharmacodynamic effect in healthy adults, showing that it had reduced glycogen levels in the subject's muscles. In April 2023, Sanofi and Maze entered into an exclusive license agreement, pursuant to which Maze would grant Sanofi an exclusive global license to its MZ001 product and associated technologies that Maze was developing for Pompe disease. While much of the evidence that supports the FTC's case remains confidential, I can say that the FTC's case relied heavily on Sanofi internal documents that assessed that Maze product, if successfully developed for Pompe disease, could present a significant threat to future sales of Sanofi's Pompe drugs. And this elimination of a nascent threat was the basis for the complaint's monopolization count. In addition to future harm in a market for Pompe drugs, the FTC also alleged that the acquisition would reduce innovation competition between Sanofi and Maze for the development of new Pompe drugs. I can't really say more about the supporting evidence for this, but that was the basis for the complaint's Section 7 count. The parties abandoned the transaction after the FTC filed its complaint for a preliminary injunction. I'd like to say, so the Sanofi-Maze case provoked some criticism or at least raised some eyebrows in some quarters with regard to certain aspects of the case. First, there was a commentary that focused on the fact that the acquired product was in a very early stage of development here, and that the FTC did not normally focus on overlap drugs in phase 1 or earlier development. These critics focused on the uncertainty inherent in drug development and the fact that most early phase drugs do not make it to market. However, there are no hard and fast rules, and in every matter, the FTC's conclusions are specifically tied to the particular facts of a given case. And while the lower probability of success might be relevant to a potential competition theory under Section 7, when the acquirer is a monopolist, the threshold for success is much lower, as Section 2 condemns nascent threats, even if the impending threat is uncertain and may take several years to monopolize. And that this position is consistent with the legal frameworks that described in the 2023 merger guidelines, and it's firmly grounded in case law. Secondly, there was a fear expressed that the Sanofi maze presaged a more general FTC crackdown on big pharma acquisitions or on big pharma partnering with small development firms, which they claimed would discourage investment in biotech startups. And a related criticism is that the FTC did not consider how Sanofi's acquisition was necessary because small startups like Maze cannot develop the drugs themselves. And the argument was that partnering with Sanofi was necessary to develop the drug and bring it to market. And again, the answer is the FTC case is grounded on the particular facts that vary from case to case. But in general, these criticisms assume that Sanofi would be the only company that could bring that successfully bring the Maze product to market. Whereas, which is the fact, it was just belied that within 5 months after the parties abandoned the transaction, Maze completed a deal on substantially similar terms with a different partner. So I think the message here is not that the FTC was challenging the acquisition by any potential pharma partner, but the message is that a monopolist or a dominant firm seeking to acquire a competitive product should carefully examine the potential antitrust risk because the FTC is particularly going to be looking at those sorts of transactions.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say here is that there's some common themes here, or some comments are that one is both acquisitions involved acquisitions by dominant firms, and that was one of the takeaways here is whereas to prevail under Section 7, the FTC has to show some reasonable probability, the exact standard varies by circuit, that the product would enter the market but for the acquisition. Whereas in these cases, the acquirer is a monopolist, the FTC may be able to prevail on a much lower threshold, and the FTC is particularly on the lookout for these acquisition of nascent threats. The other thing is that in many cases, as in both of these cases, the FTC finds the parties' own regular course documents are highly probative and relied heavily on these documents in their litigation. In both Mallinckrodt and Sanofi, the FTC relied on company documents revealing that the acquirers viewed the acquired products to be significant competitive threats, and we particularly put stock in projections of future sales or market shares that the companies relied on to value the target company and or assign a defensive value to the acquisition. And my last comment is that a point of differentiation here between the two companies is that Mallinckrodt was more closer to what is being discussed here as a classic killer acquisition, in that the FTC basically alleged that Quest Corp purchased Synactin for defensive reasons without the intention to develop the drug. Whereas in Sanofi, the FTC's theory was a little bit more nuanced, and was not that necessarily Sanofi planned to kill the acquired product, but that it would develop the drug in a way that would maximize the monopoly profits from its portfolio of Pompe drugs.
Thanks a lot, James. I think these are two very illustrative examples, straight to the point of what potential killer acquisitions can look like if structured not as a merger. Now, Anne, we heard a lot about James mentioning internal documents for the assessment carried out by the FTC. As a lawyer advising companies, you are at the forefront of actually detecting killer acquisitions in order to make sure that your clients don't run into antitrust risk, that they don't actually engage in potentially anti-competitive transactions, be it as mergers or other type of transactions. But you're also kind of there to help them kind of when taking a decision later on in the lifetime of a drug after an acquisition when it comes to potential discontinuations. So how do you go about that job in practice?
So you already alluded to that, and this is a different position that we are in compared to researchers and academics. We actually do get to see the documents that you don't get to see. So the ones that are, internal company documents, we get to see oftentimes, internal government stacks that are prepared, sales pitches that are prepared internally. And so a big part of our role, and I have to say this has really increased in a deal context over the past years, is to help our clients make sure that they use the proper language in those documents. So oftentimes, even if you prepare a sales pitch, of course, there is an inherent goal in that, which is if you do it internally to get funding for the project that you're supporting. But we really want to make sure that our clients properly reflect risk in those documents, that if a document is prepared for a specific audience or for a specific purpose, that is also properly reflected, if not in the document itself, in the emails, in the exchanges leading up to the preparation of the document. I think it's also really important that these internal company documents are put in their adequate context, and sometimes it's important to also reflect that in writing, and that avoids misinterpretations later on. And Ulla, that goes also very much to, if we are in a situation where in the course of a project there is a discontinuation for whatever reason, and again, I mentioned earlier there can be many, we want to make sure that the rationale for that is properly reflected in the internal documents. Again, that avoids a lot of misinterpretation. It avoids a lot of discussion later on. And if there is an investigation for whatever reason, or a deal is scrutinized, it helps if, the documents are clear on the face of it. I should also say, just taking a step back from the internal company documents, of course, what we also do, and this is obvious, if our clients negotiate and enter into R&D collaborations or licensing agreements, we also get involved, often at a very early stage, to help them make sure that those agreements are fully compliant with Article 101. We have sufficient guidance and rules in Europe to help us with that self-assessment. But those are really, I would say, the core areas where we come in and how we help our clients. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks a lot, Anne. Maybe a quick follow-up question also to James on detectability. You mentioned that the first of the two cases was not notifiable under the HSR. So how did the FTC get knowledge about that case? What did lead you to kind of look a bit closer and ultimately challenge the transaction? And secondly, the second transaction, the Sanofi Maze one, was indeed notifiable under the HSR. So there has been, I think, a change in HSR rules in 2013. Maybe you can say a couple of words, background to why certain exclusive licenses have been made notifiable and what the impact is that we see today.
Yes, sure. So at the time prior to the end of 2013, due to the way that the HSR rules were interpreted with regard to the characterization of what constituted an exclusive license, the exclusive license between QuestScore and Novartis was not reportable, and we just learned of the acquisition in the news. QuestScore actually issued a press release announcing the acquisition, and as I mentioned, due to their repeated price increases, QuestScore was on the FTC's radar at the time, and so we just learned about the transaction from monitoring the news. Later in 2013, the HSR rules were clarified to make it clear that any pharmaceutical licenses that transfer, quote, all commercially significant rights, end quote, are deemed to be potentially reportable acquisitions under the HSR Act. Prior to that time, the FTC determined exclusivity by looking at whether all the rights to make, use, and sell the patent were transferred to the licensee. And in certain cases in the that were common in the pharmaceutical industry, where the drug manufacturer might retain the right to manufacture the product or API, but only for the licensee, or retain certain co-rights to manufacture, develop, or promote the product, rendered those licenses non-reportable under the HSR Act. This was changed in 2013 to basically capture pharmaceutical transaction where all the commercially significant rights are transferred to the licensee. And this change was confined only to the pharmaceutical industry. Now that's broadly also includes in vitro diagnostic and biological, as well as medical and botanical manufacturing, but not to the general industry at large, basically due to prior experience that the FTC had with reviewing these transactions. In the statement of basis and purposes for explaining the change, the pre-merger notification office noted that in the 5 years prior to the rule change, it had received 66 filings for exclusive licenses, and all involved the pharmaceutical industry. And some of the reasons for the change was that staff in our division who investigated pharmaceutical transactions had been communicating to them that the current rules were not capturing transactions that could potentially raise competitive issues, but were escaping notification under the current interpretations.
Thanks a lot, James. That's quite clear. So there was kind of like a perceived jurisdictional gap, and there was some action to kind of like cover that with the amendment of the HSR rules. Now, I think we're getting close to the end of panel 2, but I still want to give the floor briefly to Professor Wollman to share his perspective, having listened to the other panelists on what could be done specifically in terms of future research when it comes to detectability and the different types of legal forms of potential killer acquisitions.
Sure, and I'll keep this brief. I think the most obvious outstanding question for researchers at this point is how much stealth consolidation, and by extension, how many killer acquisitions are out there. This came up earlier a little bit, but I'll just reiterate that there is obviously no clearinghouse for private business transactions. And so I think if we're being honest, and this includes a criticism perhaps of my own work, I think we have no idea the true scale of the problem at this point. Just to give a quick example, in the dialysis industry, my first paper, more broadly macro-sized, on non-reportable mergers, used data from Thomson Reuters, now called Refinitiv, and that is widely regarded as the most comprehensive merger database in existence. But in my second paper, which studied dialysis, I used data from Medicare, the federal U.S. healthcare system, and there I could see every facility's ownership because I had the administrative data. And I found that just half of the transactions that had actually occurred wound up in the Thomson database, which was alleged to be comprehensive. Worse yet, in a way, the problem was growing over time. And also, the transactions that were the most horizontal and that I found were the most destructive in terms of quality were the least likely to be reported publicly. By extension, the Lear study, for example, in my view, does a truly exceptional job at gathering a large number of deals, and then includes traditional acquisitions and non-traditional acquisitions in the form of licensing. But even there, the details of the transactions needed to be publicized one way or the other. So I think it's not clear, again, what the full scope of the problem is. Beyond that, I think there's just the broad policy question. That is, what we're to do about this. Should we make all transactions notified? That's probably too costly. Could we create a separate notification program for smaller transactions, which would have limited requirements that would not impose a huge burden? I think on the merging parties, that seems more sensible. But in any case, we're going to have to weigh the costs and benefits. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. So we've heard different perspectives on detectability, prevalence, and also the different forms of potential killer acquisitions. We have had some questions in the chat that have been answered by the different panelists in the meantime. I've tried to put in the links for the 2 cases mentioned by James from the FTC, for those who are interested to read more details. So that leaves me to actually thank all of the panelists very deeply for having contributed to a lively debate today. I think it was very useful and interesting for our audience. And with that, I would close the second panel and hand over to Thomas Deisenhofer for concluding remarks on the entire workshop and the study.
Thank you, Ulla. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. Good morning to the US panelists. My name is Thomas Deisenhofer. I'm the leader of the team who set up this study, who designed the study, and accompanied the study throughout these 2 years. And I must say it has been an amazing afternoon or morning from my perspective to see this all coming together, world-leading experts commenting on the study, showing new aspects, showing avenues for further research. So this was really, truly amazing. I took a lot of notes, but I couldn't follow on everything. And so I'm really happy that we are recording this workshop and that I will be able to look again at it. And so this is also a tip for everybody else who was not able to keep up with everything. So my task is now to summarize an extremely rich debate, and that is really a challenging task, and I will have some difficulties, so bear with me. But let's start. What are the main lessons that I at least take away from this very rich afternoon? So first, we heard, what do we mean with a killer acquisition? Paolo Bucci-Rossi started very helpfully by defining that. Florian was telling us rightly that when we speak about, or also the subject of this research, so a hardcore killer acquisition where a molecule is really discontinued, that is just one or the most extreme form of harm to competition. Because obviously research can be delayed, research can be reoriented in other directions, or simply products can be set in the market, placed in the market in a differentiated way, and their price competition would go away. So we have to, obviously, we're just seeing here in the study and in most of the work, the most extreme form of ending of innovation competition and price competition. A similar point was made by Justus, that he said what we have is research on ending molecules, but we have so far not much research on delay and speed. Interesting point made by James, brought up, that is made, that we hear frequently in these cases. But why would a competition enforcer be concerned at a very early stage of research, where there's a lot of uncertainty about the success of the molecule? What I have seen, at least in my practice, and I think, is that even at that early stage, what we care about is the innovation race. And if in a narrow innovation space where there are only few innovators, the innovation race is over, we know with certainty at that moment that there is less innovation competition going forward. And that in itself is probably already something which should give us rise for concern. Then probably the key question that with what we started this study is, do killer acquisitions exist? How frequent are they? And on this rightly reminded us that molecules are discontinued not always for strategic reasons, or very often there are simply objective reasons, because the trial doesn't work out. We know all that phase 3 is very often the litmus test in pharma, and that products are not successful. And so that was also something which Lear tried really, I think, well to address, is that there may be entirely legitimate reasons to discontinue molecules. So it's not the point to say that all acquisitions are killer acquisitions, but how to find amongst those that lead to discontinuations the ones that are not justified by legitimate reasons. And here, Florian's research is more coming from the statistical level, and showed that from a statistical point it was likely. The Lear study is complementary and goes down really deal by deal, but still on a large automated base, and shows on the one hand that we have a quite large number of deals where we really cannot see directly the objective justification, but on the other hand, it also didn't find the snow leopard itself. We have to also remind us that there was not a single transaction that was identified in this study as a clear killer acquisition, but just these transactions that deserve scrutiny. So what makes me at least confident that they are killer acquisitions? Certainly the work of the FTC, the Mallinckrodt and the Sanofi case we've heard. These are fully investigated cases. We have also our own cases in the past where we concluded that the risk of pipeline termination based on internal documents was indeed very strong. Perhaps one additional point that I cannot refrain from mentioning is that in 2013, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants published a guide on how to account for the acquisitions of IPR products and products in development. And they expressly introduced, after 5 years of preparatory work, a new category of defensive acquisitions, where the sole purpose of the acquisition was to prevent others from owning and continuing to develop the assets. So if the Association of American Certified Accountants introduces this type of rule, I'm pretty confident that this is not something that just exists in the head of researchers or competition enforcers. Now, next question. The forms that these acquisitions take. Doug, I have to listen again to Doug, because Doug gave us at least 3 or 4 forms that I was not even aware of and which are not in the study. So I have to listen very carefully again to what he had to say about warehousing and options. The study helpful goes beyond further research, trust research, and helpfully goes into R&D licensing, R&D cooperation agreements, asset purchase agreements. So that is a very important element of the study. And this adds to Tom's point, is the study shows actually that there's probably a large universe of transactions of which we simply don't know anything about. And that universe of transactions is probably much, much bigger than the universe of transactions we know a little bit about. What's interesting is that the 2 cases from the FTC are both not M&A. They are both licensing, exclusive licensing. And that in itself shows that competition authorities need to go beyond classic M&A to see what's going on. Then we had a very interesting presentation of what we know about the effects of M&A on innovation. We had Carmine, Justus. I liked very much the recent study of Carmine, which goes beyond the statistical effects on R&D expenditure and on patenting, but follows the inventors and sees their patenting, which I think goes a bit already the way in which Justus asked to orientate further research, namely to follow a little bit the inventors and see whether overall there is then a likelihood of overall less innovation. Then we had an important point which was made by Justus and then also brought up by Vincent, but doesn't the study show that the overlaps are relatively infrequent? And so I can also dare not refrain from pointing everybody to Annex A3 of the study, which discusses very clearly how many deals could actually not be analyzed in this study for overlaps, because there was no data in the clinical trials database, essentially. And I did myself a little bit the math. And if you really look then how many deals were analyzed for overlaps, you see that the one around 800 were analyzed for overlaps, and 500 of those, a bit more than 500, had at least a broad overlap. So you have a measure that shows that the majority of deals, as we competition enforcers expect, are actually horizontal deals and are not complementary deals that one should not be too concerned about. Same applies obviously for the number of discontinuations. I find 240 discontinuations sorry, no, it's the, I have to get the numbers right. But we have 183, according to the study, discontinuation of around 800 deals that could be analyzed, a significant number. Now we have to then see that many of them were probably justified, but we also have to see that firms have a good reason to write that discontinuations were objectively justified, in particular if they spend money on acquiring molecules before, and so they have reasons to tell this to their shareholders. Next point, how to detect them. This was the purpose of the second part. So the bad news is we have limited knowledge of the dark matter. There is not much public information there. Anne told us that she sees all that information. She's probably the one in the room who sees most. I think Doug in his career has also seen quite a lot. So these two in the room are the ones who have seen more than anybody else. We also have to see that this was essentially the limit of the study. This study was based, limitation of the study, on publicly available information. And that's why we couldn't get, I think, to the snow leopard level. We could only point to the deals deserving scrutiny. Now, limited good news here. Obviously, competition authorities like the FTC, James has shown this, and the DG Comp have investigative powers to get to these information, to the internal documents, and then it gets often relatively easy to distinguish between the good and the bad deals. And then again, very interesting, Doug gave us at least 3 or 4 interesting publicly available OSINT sources, so open source intelligence sources of where to get information on pharma deal. I will listen again very carefully on what he had to say on this. I'm coming to the end, so don't worry. I'm a bit long, sorry for this, but it was a rich version. An interesting point was then, why is it important that enforcers are present? And I think here Tom's and Florian's research shows something puzzling, is that just below threshold. So just you have this bumping of deals which look more suspicious, just there where enforcers are not present. So where there's no notification or where the likelihood of getting an investigation is below the thing. So it's clear that there is, which is normal, strategic designing of deals, strategic conclusions of deals, not to be under the spotlight of antitrust enforcers. And that just shows that antitrust enforcers need to probably think of how they can be more present in those areas where currently you have this bunching of deals which escape scrutiny. The other thing that I found interesting was Carmina's point that once enforcers are there and putting the light on a certain area, the likelihood of having bad deals is going down. And so if you have in that area lower likelihood or lower frequency of killer acquisitions, that is also logical because that's the deterrent effect of competition law. And so one should not read too much into lower numbers in killer acquisitions in mergers, M&A, which is the most visible part, in phase 3 trial, phase 3 of pharma, which is everybody can see this. It's visible to the entire world. So the likelihood that you will find something bad there is actually lower than in the dark matter. Now, last substantive point is future research. I think this came from several, from Justus. I think Carmine also said, develop predictive tools. we would love that. That was actually one of the objectives of the study. I think the study will help us to sharpen the predictive tools that DG Comp is currently using in selecting cases for scrutiny in merger and also in antitrust. But we are far from automatic tools. I just have to think, and I think the pharma world is too varied to come up with very simple, easy rules to automatically detect the likely killer acquisition. You can perhaps filter a little bit, but then the groundwork has to be done further. Then the other proposal was the effect to look at the effects on researchers by Justus, which was a very interesting proposal and fully endorse. And Justus' point also the effects on competitors. I think this is crucial because if we just look at what's going on at the merging parties, you are missing half of the negative effects if there are indeed negative effects. For me, the biggest follow-on question is the one raised by Tom Wollmann in the end, is how can we know more about the dark side of the moon? How can we know more about what's going on in the preclinical trial stage? I'm pretty sure that if you have a billion-dollar blockbuster in a certain area, drug, you probably watch carefully what respected researchers are doing in the startup phase and in the venture capital phase before you reach the clinical trial stage, and you want to be involved. And there is research showing that there are partnerships, there are licensing agreements, and so on in this preclinical trial phase. So I personally would be very interested to have more research on this. Now let me conclude with a big thank you to several people. One, to Lear, Paolo, Alessia, to Doug, and the whole team of Lear who have done an incredible study, very rich. This was painful, and the pain also comes partly from me, and so I have to apologize for all the hard times that we gave to Lear, but I think the outcome was really worth it. It's a wonderful piece of work. Thank you to the team in DG Comp that accompanied the study. That's Ulla, Vincent was there, a lot of people from the merger unit, a lot of people from the pharma antitrust unit, Blaž, Gabriele, Scholt, excellent. Thank you, Julien. Thank you so much. Without you, this study would not have seen the light. A huge thank you to the panelists who have made this an amazing, for me, amazing, hope also for the listeners outside, amazing afternoon. I've learned a lot. I will listen again. Thank you for helping us to do our job better. And last but not least, a big thank you to the communications team who had set up the WebEx platform and the publicity and also the registrations for the thing. Thank you, Karin. Thank you, Talia. Thank you, Edson, and everybody. So with that's it. Big thank you to all. Have a good further afternoon, and let's continue discussing and working on this exciting topic also in the future.